MDMA. And in going over this, I realized that I had 10 different approaches I use, and most people might only be aware of one or two. But before I go into the 10 different approaches, I want to basically talk about different theoretical models for dealing with trauma, because those are very different. And I think it's important to have a flexibility around your models of how to deal with trauma. One of them, which I find most people come to me with, is this idea that if I get to the bottom of the trauma, like, when I was 5 years old, this happened, or, I was raped at this age, and go over that the trauma will be resolved once and for all and disappear. As with all theories, this is true in some cases and not true in other cases. So the thing I'll say is that, especially when people have this in terms of a psychological framework, they think, oh, if I just knew it happened to me when I was 3 years old, everything would be great. I don't see that happen. The research doesn't support it. And I think that although this is a very common theory, it is actually the least useful, in my opinion. But, feel free to have your own opinion about this. Another way of looking at dealing with trauma is what I would call a skills approach, meaning you may be aware of the trauma, you may not be aware of it, but obviously people get triggered and they have intense emotions come up, often in relationships, sometimes not in relationships, with different things that show up in life. And you're having a trauma reaction when there seems to be such a huge reaction for something that really doesn't require such a huge reaction, and it may last with you for a long time. And that's an example of where you probably are reacting some to a trauma in previous times in your life. And so with a lot of people, I try to teach them the skills to handle the anxiety and emotions that come up that feel like they are overblown. And most people are pretty bad at this. They don't have, if you ask them, please do a lecture on how to handle anxiety and strong emotions effectively, most people that lecture lasts less than a minute. They really don't have a lot of ideas about that. So, one of the things they do is they might distract themselves. Okay, well, that's a 5-second lecture. I distract myself. But there's obviously a lot of skills here about how to handle emotions, from breathing methods to catharsis, screaming and hitting your bed, to uh, different meditations. I'll go into some of the methods that we'll talk about today. And it's good to give people the skills of techniques that really work well for them. And in the training, I talk about some of those skills. I'm going to talk about more of those skills today. You want to become an expert in some of these skills. I realized I once made a list. I have 47 ways of handling strong feelings of anxiety and emotions. And some of them work well for me, some don't. Some take 10 seconds, some take 10 minutes, some take 10 hours. It's really nice to have a grab bag of tools this way. But really, all you have to do is teach your clients one or two of your favorites that you feel really work, because most people actually, other than denial and distraction, do not have effective skills that way. A third approach, which people tend to know the least about, is to go into what's called higher states of consciousness, where the trigger just doesn't exist. Now, I'm part of a group where people are seeking enlightenment and have a lot of higher consciousness techniques. Let me give you an example. One meditation is to focus on, spend a minute focusing on 10 people or animals that you love. And for each one of those minutes, you just really get into a heart opening space. You think of people or animals that you love and what you appreciate about them. After 10 minutes of doing this, you're in a really loving place and your trigger just isn't there. So you could call that a very effective form of distraction, but really you're changing your vibration so that you're in a higher state of consciousness. And in, a higher state of consciousness, your triggers just aren't affecting you. It's kind of like, if you go to Florida, you don't need to bring your winter jacket. Just being in Florida means that, you're probably pretty warm. And just being in a higher state of consciousness where you're experiencing joy or love or deep peace means that you're kind of rising above the trigger. And in fact, that can be a great way to overcome triggers, is just to be able to see it from this higher place. Obviously, meditations of different kinds and different types of guided meditations or specific forms of meditation can be very effective for that. We will have time for you to ask questions in a little bit. Oh, and here's a great way to help with triggers. Just one second. I've actually been using this in some of my work with people, is show them a cute puppy, and that will help people overcome their animosity and blame, and often this can get them out of a trigger. Can I get a kiss? Yes, thank you very much. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, really, think of, most of you now are smiling, and I've actually used this because it really does interrupt people's state very well. And this one in particular, who is ridiculously cute, can be very effective. Unfortunately, I don't have extra ones of those that you can borrow. Um, so let me go over various specific approaches for dealing with trauma. One which is very well documented is EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization repertoire or something like that. I actually don't know. My wife's a well-known EMDR therapist. But what I can tell you is that there's a lot of science showing that it works really well. It takes a long time to be trained in it usually. There are some shortcuts to that. There's something called brain spotting, which is really a simplified form of EMDR. There's other things that are uh, EMDR like, and I'm not an EMDR therapist, so I don't use it, but I sometimes will give referrals to an EMDR therapist, and it's a great technique. And other than MDMA training and MDMA therapy, it's probably the most scientifically studied way of dealing with trauma. Then there's EFT, which stands for Emotional Freedom Technique. That's simpler. Most people can learn that in at least the basics of it in a couple of hours. You can get books on that, called Emotional Freedom Technique. There's lots of videos online about it. It's basically a energetic form of dealing with trauma, meaning you're tapping various points on people are tapping their own points on their body like this while saying certain phrases. Um, just as with every technique, some people find it great, some people find it good, and some people find it useless. I generally find that the more emotional a person is, the better EFT works. If you don't have that in your repertoire, I think, in 2 or 3 hours, you can learn the basics online for free or in a book. And it's a nice technique, and being that it doesn't take very long, it can be a simple way of helping people with trauma, especially people who are emotional or energetically sensitive. In the training, we talked about the Mach-Newey method, so I won't go over it, but it's one of my favorites. It's something that sometimes I can help people over trauma, especially if they're having flashbacks or visual flashbacks. In 5 minutes, they can eliminate it. That's where people have a movie that they're going forward and backwards, and they're adding ridiculous elements to it. And what that does is it takes the images and ideas in their brain, and it basically kind of makes it so ridiculous that a person's no longer traumatized, and your brain will tend towards a ridiculous image over a traumatic image. And I found this to be incredibly effective. It does work best for people who can visualize things. And it works incredibly well for people who might have negative visual images that stick with them over trauma. So that's thoroughly explained in the training. And if you haven't used that method or if you're not aware of it, it's pretty easy to learn. And the effects are often immediate and long lasting. So I highly recommend that you get uh, familiar and comfortable with that method. Now, one of the reasons why MDMA seems to work so well is basically it desensitizes the trauma. And what you do, let's say somebody was violently hit by their parents, and they were traumatized by it. As they talk about that during the MDMA experience, the amygdala is kind of offline, so they can talk about it easily without fear. And there's a sense that you're desensitizing or taking all the juice out of that experience by having them talk about it in detail and going over it visually in detail. So it's a very effective, the MDMA is very effective. Now, you can also do this without MDMA. It takes a lot longer. It's called desensitization training. Um, and that is the kind of the preferred method most psychologists are using to deal with traumas. Unfortunately, it might take a year before somebody can talk about their rape experience or being beaten without triggering their amygdala and triggering intense feelings. So this is like a very quick way of doing desensitization training. And I do generally have people talk about their traumatic experiences, and then they are surprised that after the MDMA, wow, that doesn't seem to trigger me this way it used to, and that's a major aspect of MDMA therapy. Once again, if you have questions about any of these things, we'll go over that as soon as I'm done with going over this list. Next, there's things I didn't really go into in the training, which I'd like to talk about. And that is one method I don't think I talked about in the training. It's a way of learning a bunch of subconscious stuff around the trauma. So the phrase is, I can't let go of this trauma because. So I have people repeat that 5 to 7 times. Some of you know my stepfather used to beat me on a somewhat regular basis. And so if I was to do this, it would sound something like this. I can't let go of my stepfather beating me because that would let him off the hook. I can't let go of it because I like to feel like a victim. I can't let go of it because he did me wrong. I can't let go of it because uh, it makes me feel important to feel like a victim. I can't let go of it because um, I now have an excuse for being upset. I can't let go of it because I don't want to forgive him. So that's a very quick way of getting information that might be useful in looking at what's surrounding the trauma. So when I did that, I realized, there's a part of me that really likes to, say that I'm a victim. And a lot of people, they don't want to let go of the trauma because they don't want to let go of being a victim. Their identity is partly in that. And then when you see that there's something like that going on, what you can do is say, well, what's the price you pay for that? Do you always like to be a victim? What's the downside of being a victim? What's the upside of letting that go? So, and this is effective whether somebody's on MDMA or not, but more effective if somebody's on MDMA. And that can be really good as a way of uh, dissecting all the stuff around trauma that tends to keep it going and keep it intact. So another repeating sentence that can be useful is, if I could let go of this trauma, I would feel. And then I have people really get into that feeling, especially a good one. You know, they might say, if I could let go of this trauma, I'd feel relaxed and at peace. And I say, well, allow yourself to feel that. Like, just imagine you let go of the trauma. You're free of it. It's in the past. It's gone. It's not in your body or energy anymore. What does that really feel like in your heart? What's that feel like? How might that affect your life if you could really let go of it? How might that affect your relationships if you really just forgive your father, stepfather, whatever it is, and really were free of it? So you get people to embody that feeling so that they see the downside of holding on to it. They see the upside of potential upside of being released from it. And that's a good rewiring of the brain. It's a good way to help people accelerate their process through the trauma, which might have taken 20 years, and doing it in 20 minutes. So that's something that I do, and it can be very effective. Very simple tool and nice to have in your tool belt. A more complicated tool, but something to talk about is what I call hypnotic reenactment. You could just call this a guided meditation, but I talk about this a tiny bit in the training. But this is when you read books on trauma, as I've read many, uh, they're usually 400 pages of talking about trauma and then one page saying this is how to cure it. And they all come down to this technique really. So if you've read a lot of trauma books, I wish they were all basically one page saying this is what you do. So this is what you do. After reading their 400-page tome, I mean, even like The Body Keeps the Score, which is a great book, you know, it has so much information about trauma, and then he has a couple ideas of how to help it, and he also has been a big proponent of using MDMA for trauma, and that was a real change for him. He first was poo-pooing the idea, and then after reviewing the research, he became one of the major proponents of using MDMA for trauma. And that book sold millions of copies. I mean, he's Dr. I forget his name, Vander's Kolb or something like that. Really, we owe a debt of gratitude for bringing trauma into the mainstream. But the technique basically says, okay, go back to the trauma. In my case, go back to when my stepfather used to beat me, and and reimagine it in a different way. For example, reimagine that you grab the belt from him and you just take it from him and walk off. Or imagine that you have your higher self there telling you that although this is painful, it really will lead to your making your life better because it will inspire you to get into meditation and hypnosis at age 11, which it did. Or imagine that a protective parent, which my mother wasn't in this case, is there and she stops him from doing what he was doing. And you reinforce this imagined scenario in which it turns out differently. Now, you probably have heard that people don't know the difference between an imagined thing and a actual thing. Like they've done this with basketball players throwing free throws. If you get somebody to throw 100 free throws a day, they get better at a certain rate. But if you get somebody to imagine throwing 100 free throws a day and that they're going in, they get better at the same rate because our body actually doesn't really know the difference between an imagined event and a real event. So going over this over and over again, or even just once, and imagining what works for them as a reenactment that feels empowering is very impactful and is kind of the psychological way that most psychologists deal with trauma. The problem is that they have to be not traumatized while doing this. That's why it often takes a year to get to this point, whereas with MDMA, you can generally do that in the first session. It's not a problem. Um, so that's what I call hypnotic reenactment or guided meditation. And then if it's recorded, people can listen to it again. That's very helpful. And then there's specific techniques. I went into the Sedona method in the training. That's a good method for dealing with the emotions and the thoughts as they come up in that moment. I won't go into depth about that because I do talk about that in the training. But there's simple breathing techniques. A lot of trauma therapists use just a simple box breathing as the intensity of emotion comes up, anxiety, whatever. Just inhale to the count of 6, hold to the count of 6, exhale to the count of 6, and don't breathe to the count of 6. Or you could do that to the count of 4, whatever. So you could try it right now. You inhale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You hold your breath 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You exhale slowly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You don't do anything for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You inhale just like that. That's called box breathing, and it's shown to regulate the uh, parasympathetic nervous system. It relaxes people, and it can be for some people, a very simple, easy technique for dealing with anxiety and trigger reactions. I want to go into a little bit of depth into my favorite new technique, one not talked about in the training, and that is what I call the and what else technique. I was highly triggered this week by an incident. I don't have to go into it here. Uh, and I use this technique, and it always helps. What I like about it is that you can teach it to somebody in 1 minute. It takes anywhere from 10 seconds or longer to do it, and it's quite effective. So as somebody's dealing with intense anxiety or intense emotions, I have them say, I notice my heart's beating really fast and I'm scared. And I also notice, you could call it the I also notice technique. I also notice that there's a beautiful tree outside my window. I also notice my butt feels warm in the chair. I also notice that some people on the screen seem to be taking notes. I also notice that my foot feels cold. I also notice that my heart is slowing down. I also notice that it's a pretty color of yellow on my desk. And you just do that. So this is obviously grounding people in presence, um, and is very effective and very easy. And it's the opposite of trauma, which is bringing the past into the present. So now you're bringing the present into the present, and it reduces the focus or the fixation on trauma thoughts and feelings. So in that way, it is a desensitization technique in that you keep on rewiring your brain. Trauma reaction, no, get back to the present. What time is it? It's present. This isn't happening now. What's happening now is my foot feels cold, my hands feel warm, or whatever. So you could call that I also notice techniques. I also notice. And The best way to teach this stuff is to learn it for yourself and to see that it works for you. And if it does work for you, then fantastic. And then you are a good teacher for this stuff. So those are 10 different approaches. What I'm going to do now, I'm still recording this. And if you don't mind being recorded with a question, uh, this would be a time to ask that question. If you don't want to be recorded for a question, after a couple questions, I'll stop the recording. But does anybody have a question that they don't mind asking to a recorded session on anything we talked about so far? Feel free to just unmute yourself and blab away.
I'd like to ask Jonathan about trauma that's kind of out of conscious memories. For example, birth trauma, prenatal trauma, early infant trauma that isn't in conscious memory, but you know its effects, or you might have experienced it in some regression thing or something.
Yeah. So pre-verbal trauma, there's two ways to look at that. One is to try to get to the originating event, which is hard. I think the best technique for doing that is holotropic breathing, or what's called connected breathing or rebirthing. All of those things can be helpful for trying to get back to that event, but that's challenging, and you do need to find a really good person trained in those methods. And if you don't know what those are, you can type in holo HOLOTROPIC, holotropic breathing, and you can find videos online. There's books about it. It's associated with Stanislav Grof, etc. But once again, the studies show that knowing the triggering event really is not that key to dealing with it. So I then go into the model of, okay, when those feelings do come up, how do you handle them? Do you go into a higher state of consciousness? Do you get better at maybe hitting your bed while screaming? Do you get better at uh, doing the and what else, or and I also notice technique, or any of these different techniques that we just went over. I think that the skills approach is something that most people don't talk about, and I'll tell you why, which is kind of funny. Therapists get paid by the hour. So if you could just teach somebody a skill and they don't need you anymore, you actually are losing business. Well, I have different incentives. I have more business than I want. So I'm always trying to get rid of clients as quickly as possible. Here's a skill. Go forth and heal yourself. But we do have to admit that the model for coaches and therapists is keep people as long as possible. And therefore, it might take 2 years to get to the bottom of this. And I go with the data, and the data shows that that is really not that effective. And the skills approach or these other approaches, I think, are at least as effective and generally a lot more effective. Thanks for that question, Duncan. Any other questions while we're recording? Yeah, Dan.
I have a question and a comment too. First, a comment, because I have a neurofeedback practice, and the neuro the research really is that when you go back and you revisit the trauma, oftentimes you're re-traumatizing
Yeah.
the brain and you're kind of reinforcing all that. So I would tend to focus more on things that bring people more into the present. But I was curious about, it seems like from the studies they've done with the vets, for the FDA approval, the MAPS protocol, they don't do a lot of therapy apparently. And so there's some inherent benefit just from MDMA that helps resolve these traumas. Like the veterans there who had these horrible experiences, I don't think they were sitting there talking to the therapist the whole time, but somehow is the medicine just effective in that way by itself? It doesn't require any
Well, that
technique.
was the theory, Dan, that basically the MAPS approach was give the medicine to people over through 3 different sessions, and the therapist was there to make sure they didn't freak out, and to say stuff like just go with the feeling and stuff. Very, because the FDA is not a therapy organization, so they were trying to avoid therapy to get FDA approval, and you saw how well that worked. They basically, the FDA, which is mostly funded by big pharma, decided no, we were not, even though the results were fantastic,
Yeah,
they
great.
still decided we're not going to do that because, it was mostly a political thing. So yes, the medicine naturally desensitizes people because it reduces blood flow to the amygdala, and the medicine does seem to have its own intelligence in which it will kind of help you to go over difficult things from your life. And in that, it's almost like doing self-therapy without the guidance so much of the therapist. So that's kind of what's going on. It is effective. And then people started to think, oh, we'll just do the MAPS approach. No, the only reason Rick Doblin decided to do that was to get FDA approval. Throwing in therapy and and having these techniques supercharges it. That's why, I have a 90% success rate of helping people overcome their trauma in one session. The MAPS approach had about a 70% success rate in 3 sessions. So I do think that this is more effective. But I don't have the $20 million to prove it.
I mean,
Yes, Cecilia. Oh, go on.
well, I'll ask another one later.
Yeah. Well, let's get Cecilia. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan. I think it was on the last call you talked about the octopus research.
Uh-huh.
I looked it up, and this scientist, this doctor who did the research, said that there's a 2 to 3 week period of neuroplasticity that opens up. And I just want to get some suggestions from you on how we could make suggestions and make recommendations to our clients during this critical period where they can make change.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Cecilia. And in case you don't know, I always forget that person's name. It's like DOL, or something like that. Anyways, the research is that not just with MDMA, but with the LSD, psilocybin, mostly, that it opens up a learning window where people are more receptive to learning. So the first thing I tell people is listen to the recording. And I think one of the reasons why people say, wow, that the recording was just as impactful as the session is because they are open to this window. I usually have my integration session about a week later. They're still in that window. So we talk about those techniques. And I often suggest that during this week, as you listen to the recording and you find any of these techniques that you found useful to you, use them so that when we are in the integration session, you'll already have information that this one works, this one doesn't. So I think it's really important that people make good use of that week by listening to the recording, trying the 2, 3, 4 techniques that we really went over in the session, and get a sense of, when I'm not MDMA, what really seems to work for me. And then in the integration session, we come up with a plan that they're using those ideas or methods. And I do the contract technique where, they're supported somehow to make sure that they stay with those techniques. So that's my approach. It's not the only approach. Other people say, journal, or talk to a friend about your session. I think those are all good suggestions. Meditate, whatever. But that's been my approach, and I do want to make sure that people really make use of that, say, 2-week period after the MDMA, so that they are getting benefit. I think you see my dogs in the background every now and then. Yeah. Does that answer your question a little bit? Okay, great. Let's do one more question, so I don't want to make the recording too long. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'm going to actually stop the recording for now and still continue the questions.